So hello everyone, thank you so much for coming to our Science Policy 101 workshop. I'm Shannon Wolfman. I'm the policy chair of the Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy Group. For those of you who are new to PSPDG, we are a student-run organization at University of Pennsylvania that aims to give people that aims to give people experiences in science policy, diplomacy, and science communication. So we have a lot of programming aimed at giving people information about these types of things. And then we have skill building workshops and then opportunities to directly apply the skills that you've used. So that's briefly what we do at PSPDG. So this workshop, Claire, Hayden, Divya, and Maeve have worked really hard on putting this workshop together. So I'm going to, sorry, I'm new to this whole hosting a Zoom meeting thing, so there's a lot going on for me at the moment. So I'm just gonna turn it over to Claire for starting off the workshop.
Okay, hi everyone. So we're just going to get started with kind of a broad overview of what science policy is. So science policy can be defined as the bridge between scientific expertise and the needs of the world. So in other words, science can inform policies, laws, regulations, and so on. And it involves using scientific training to translate highly technical scientific findings into good policy. In other words, policy that is supported by data. Anyone with a scientific background can productively engage in scientific policy, and science policy focuses on using expertise from research training to inform policy decisions on key issues. And I just want to point out this is distinct from policy for science, which focuses more on advocating for research in specific areas. So policy for science is mostly related to policy that impacts how science is done. In other words, usually funding. But both policy for science and science policy are intertwined and interconnected, and they're both really valid and important applications of scientific expertise. Next slide. Okay, so whether you are involved in policy or not, science inherently relies on the political realm. So there's a lot of examples for how science and policy interact. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. So one kind of relates back to what I was saying about policy for science. The government has a huge role in determining which types of research to fund. So kind of a current example of this would be that the Trump administration has focused funding on artificial intelligence and quantum computing and depleted funding for climate science. And related to that, public opinion on certain research can impact how policymakers regard that work when they make policy. So an example of that would be if the public is against stem cell research, then perhaps they would lobby their congressman to fund stem cell research less, and then we would have less stem cell research being done as a result. So these two examples kind of talk about how society molds politics and politics control science. But I want to turn that around for my last example to show how science can inform both society and politics. So in a lot of cases, scientific research is used as evidence for or against certain policies. So one really clear example of this is in the 1970s, there was a lot of accumulated research on neurotoxins and their impact on human health and especially childhood development. And that ended in a 1978 ban on lead paint. So this is a really solid example of how science informed policy to the benefit of the public. And I also want to point out that advocating for science policy purposes helps to ensure that your research is completely understood and applied to policy accordingly. So basically what I'm getting at here is if politicians are going to use your work, it's probably better to make sure that they use it correctly. It's probably not a surprise to most of you that politicians are kind of notorious for taking science out of context. Kind of a hot button topic lately has been the flu vaccine, the yearly flu vaccine, and its effectiveness. So notoriously, the flu vaccine is kind of around 40 to 60% effective at actually reducing your risk of getting the flu. And so politicians and the public in general kind of take that information and say, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't bother getting the vaccine if it's not that effective. But I think scientists would kind of agree that that's not what our research actually is trying to imply here. So it's really important that scientists kind of contextualize what we're saying. So this goes back to communication with both the public and with politicians so that they fully understand what our research implies and what it means, and that they can properly apply it to policy. Next slide, please. So should scientists even be involved in policy? There are several barriers that tend to prevent scientists, especially scientists in academia, from engaging in policy. And I think this has changed a lot in recent decades, but I want to go over these points just to be completely clear. So as scientists, we tend to keep our work as objective and unbiased as possible. This is really important. This is part of our training to make sure that our research is objective as much as it can be. But I think it's important to note that we can be objective in research and still care about how the world uses our work. And going back to what I said before, because politics inherently impacts the research we do, because institutions are controlling our funding, that means that if we do not engage, it ends up, one, hurting society because society ends up being less informed and maybe even in danger in some cases. But it also hurts us as scientists because it ends up affecting the research that we do and that we are able to do because of funding. So another barrier that I want to point out is that scientists who want to be involved in policy sometimes tend to fear that they won't be taken seriously. And one aspect of that is that they're worried that their career in academia could be affected if they're being seen as a political activist. And I think this is becoming a lot less common in recent years, especially because it's becoming normalized for scientists to stay in academia and also on the side focus on policy and be engaged in that way. But another aspect of this is that scientists are afraid that they will lose some credibility if they become involved in policy, both from the academic community and from the public in general. And I just want to point out that the public does see trained scientists as credible, and by extension, so do politicians. But I don't expect you to just take my word for it. I know that a lot of you here are probably trained scientists, so maybe we should look at actual data on this. So this is from a paper published in 2017. It's from a randomized controlled national experiment with a little bit over 1,000 participants. And participants were asked to read Facebook posts about climate change. So there were 6 different groups with 6 different posts ranging from a scientist simply explaining his research to the same scientist advocating for specific policies based on his research. And next slide. Essentially, what they found was that the public sees the scientists and scientific community as credible. So even though some statements were seen as more politically motivated than others, in every case, all of the participants saw the scientist as credible and qualified to make policy recommendations. So what this really means is that having training makes you qualified to apply your skills to policy discussions. So with all of that being said, we are going to go into breakout rooms now, and I would like you to discuss with your group what are some concerns and maybe fears that you have as a scientist being involved in science policy. All right, so I think mostly everyone is back now. So if anyone wants to share anything interesting that they talked about in their groups.
I can go if that'd be helpful.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we spent a good amount of time talking about how us as scientists were so like siloed in our one area of study, and then we're coming into this policy landscape where suddenly we need to be the scientist who kind of understands everything, and there's a degree of imposter syndrome and some credibility issues that we were dealing with in that respect.
That's actually really good. We're going to talk about that in just a few minutes, actually. So yeah, good point. Very good point. Any other thoughts?
We were chatting briefly about like our words being misconstrued, or as science changes and you have to change your mind with it, looking like you don't have credibility because you change your positions. I gave example of Dr. Fauci saying something about masks back in March, which was reasonable and still like having consequences for now, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's definitely important. And it's kind of hard because a lot of people don't necessarily understand the scientific method if they don't have training in it. So it's not as easy to kind of translate the fact that we don't always know everything all the time to some people who are expecting us to know everything about science all the time. So yeah, that's definitely a challenge.
I'd like to make a quick plug for our SciComm communication or our science communication workshop series, where our final workshop will be about addressing uncertainty and controversy in science while remaining credible. Sorry, continue, Claire.
Our group also kind of talked about that, about like, specifically from the perspective of there's pressure from the politics world to have a consistent view, and like whether that would, like if you're really involved with them, would that affect how you perceive things scientifically and your sort of flexibility to, you know, just look at the data. And also thinking about whether there's certain institutions in politics that are like more shielded from this sort of partisan partisanism, like taking one side or the other, versus like when you're interacting directly with politicians. It can be hard to do that.
Yeah, I think we're also going to touch on that a little bit too, but it's also relevant to mention, I think, like if you're trying to advocate for something that's kind of a hot topic and very debatable amongst the public or amongst politicians, it's kind of a lot harder to portray yourself as unbiased when you're doing that. Because if you're giving data for climate change, for example, and there's kind of two sides of an issue where some people say climate change is real, climate change is not real, then you're automatically taking a side by supporting the science. So even though, like, as scientists, it doesn't feel necessarily biased to us to go with what the data says, some people are going to take what you're saying as biased either way. So that's another aspect of that for sure.
I think to sort of add to that, we talked a little bit about how within the policy and the political world, there's like a lot more anger and sort of like harshness than this. I mean, some of that exists in the science world, but I think sort of less so. And so in that same way that like people can take your opinion as biased, right? Them taking it as biased can end up impacting you much more seriously in terms of your career, in terms of your position, than a similar dispute in like within the purely scientific context can.
Yeah, I think that's true as well, but I also think it's definitely worth mentioning that you don't necessarily have to engage in every hot button topic out there. As a scientist, you can engage in maybe some less mainstream controversies where you can apply your science to understanding something as simple as whether or not you should maybe like build a playground in a certain area of a town, and like what is the quality of the soil in that area? Is there something in the soil that could leach into the wood and cause diseases for children or something like that? It's just an example, but like not everything that you as a scientist have to do necessarily has to be like a controversial topic either.
I wanted to jump in really quick and mention that also not every scientist that weighs in on a controversial topic is Dr. Fauci. So if you weigh in as a scientist in one of the various ways that we're going to discuss later in this workshop, most likely it's not going to be garnering national attention and riling people up too much. So I think that there's a little bit of disproportionality that might be at play in that fear, although it is concerning. I wanted to mention that Ashraf had a comment that policymakers are resisting science facts and debating with the scientists who have no similar, or with scientists with no similar agreements on the debate. So I think that's sort of, a disadvantage that scientists have, that sometimes the science isn't settled, but people's opinions might be. So I think that maybe we should move to the next section. So thank you so much, Claire. So up next will be Hayden. So Hayden, take it away.
So I forget who actually mentioned it, but you kind of like gave me a great transition. Somebody brought up the fear of, as scientists, we're sort of siloed into one very, very specific niche, specifically like research scientists. And in science policy, you need to be able to sort of speak on a variety of different topics. And we're going to talk about that in a few slides. But my section is about, now that you know what science policy is, what knowledge or skills do you need to get involved? Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about sort of which skills do research scientists have that are applicable to science policy, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. So first off, when you're coming into science policy, you either come from one or two backgrounds, basically. You're either a scientist, like most, if not all of us here are, or you come from policy making, a government position. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what are the differences and similarities between getting involved with science policy, having a science background versus a policy background. Next slide, please. So to look at the benefits, first of all, Harvard School of Medicine did a study sort of seeing in science policy, what's the difference between having scientific training and policy training. So some of the benefits, and this is probably obvious, but as you'll see, there's like a reason for this. Some of the benefits for having scientific training and getting into science policy are you have a lot of the analytical skills, the curiosity, knowledge of the scientific process. You basically can understand science already, and this relates back to the siloing thing, which I'll sort of elaborate on later. But all skills sort of related to scientific research, a lot of them are translatable to science policy. And conversely, if you come from a policy training background, you have that knowledge of how the government works. You have interpersonal skills training, including persuasion, communication, like formal communication, and sort of like understanding of how policy works. Next slide, please. And so on the other hand, there are gaps that there sort of exist with each training, because in science policy, you need to have the knowledge of the science and the policy. So if you're coming as a scientist, some of the gaps that you might have an unfamiliarity with how the government works, insufficient communication skills training, because as scientists, communication is essential and very important, but we don't have necessarily the training for formal communication. And there is not as much understanding of policy in general. And then some of the gaps in policy training are you're unfamiliar with how the scientific process actually works, and you just don't understand like the nuances of science. And so sort of looking at this, what's the point is the benefits of having scientific training sort of parallel the gaps in policy training and vice versa. And so even though we are not taught formally as scientists how to formally communicate as scientists, this is a very learnable skill. And so learning to communicate formally and about how the government works is much easier than what most of you have already done as PhD scientists, learning how to think of the world from a scientific perspective. So while we may lack some of these skills, I'd argue that it's probably not too difficult to put in the work to learn about the government policy to go into science policy, versus learning about science is possibly harder. And Maeve will talk about it more, but PPDG has a lot of different workshops, science communication workshops, as Shannon talked about before, that can help you build these skills. Next slide, please. So the study by Harvard School of Medicine interviewed science policy experts from a variety of different backgrounds on skills they felt were important for science policy work. And the most cited skill was good communication abilities, both oral and written. So again, I mentioned this a little on the last slide, but as scientists having to write papers and everything, we have a very good understanding of written communication, but communication related to government, like policy memos, et cetera, and oral communication. These are skills that we might not possess, but they're very easily learnable, especially with the help of organizations like PSPDG. And then some other main skills include humility and respect, managing projects, social skills and networking, curiosity and openness, how the government works, and persuasion and advocacy. And so talking a little bit more about these skills, the skills in yellow are sort of things that scientists are already familiar with. You're coming with translatable skills like managing projects, which is sort of the focus of a research scientist, and curiosity and openness, which are things that you have to have to succeed in research. And then the things like networking, how the government works, and advocacy, while they are slightly networking and advocacy somewhat play a role in research science, they're mainly on the policy side, but these are not hard things if you put in the time and effort to sort of get in contact with organizations like PSPDG and to inform yourself by reading. It's not hard to get to that level. And so I just want to emphasize a little the humility and respect, which I'll get into a little bit more on the next slide. But there has to be sort of a balance in your confidence as yourself as a scientist, and also your knowledge that you need to be humble because you don't fully understand policy as well as people that are around you. So humility and respect is sort of crucial, because while you may understand the science, you might not understand how that actually transfers into policies being made. And then again, to plug PSPDG, we help with navigating how the government works, including lobbying legislators, memo writing. So a lot of these skills that you might be like, where can I look? If you have any interest, PSPDG does a lot of good like hand holding to help you get involved in science policy by informing you about the actual policy aspects. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give a few examples to sort of get you guys thinking about your expertise. So if a neurobiologist is asked a question about cancer biology, will they be able to find more complete or less complete answers than a lawyer, firefighter, et cetera, and why? Anyone can shout it out. It's a pretty obvious answer.
More complete, because they know more about like biology.
Yeah, so this is related to the sort of the comment about a fear of being siloed in your specific niche. Even though a neurobiologist doesn't have the understanding of in-depth cancer biology questions, knowing about the scientific process and biology, they'll be able to find a more complete answer much easier than a lawyer, firefighter, et cetera. And then not even talking about similar fields, a computer scientist would be able to learn about biology much easier than a lawyer, firefighter, et cetera, would be able to, because in science in general, regardless of what field or niche you're in, you know a lot about paper writing, the scientific process, how to find applicable professionals to educate yourself, et cetera. So I guess the point of this is sort of to show you it is kind of scary, because you're coming from, let's say, working on figuring out a bit about a specific receptor that plays a role in one specific feedback loop or something, to sort of looking at science and how it impacts society in a much larger macro sort of realm. But even though there is this difference between a niche and in science policy having to look at a variety of different issues, your understanding of the scientific process and just generally how science works is largely translatable and makes you more prepared than the average person. And then in many psychological studies, it has been found that high achievers tend to underestimate their mastery of or expertise in topics. And so since most, if not all of you, are in a PhD program, postdoc, et cetera, at a top school, it indicates that you are in this group of high achievers. So just make sure you're not underestimating yourself. You are capable of working in science policy, and sort of, you know your stuff is what I'm trying to say. And then again, I talked about this a little before, but it's super important that confidence is paramount when approaching science policy. You need to know that you have the knowledge necessary to make an informed decision and act on it. So it's hard, especially when you're first talking to policymakers, and I know people voice their concerns because you come from different backgrounds. It's hard sometimes, even though you know that your data seem to be suggesting something, it's hard to sort of like speak up, because it's just, you're scared that you might be wrong, but you need to just be confident in your scientific knowledge. But at the same time, humility is necessary, because you do not possess the political knowledge that a lot of the other people that you're working with in government do. So there needs to be a balance sort of in confidence in yourself as a scientist, although there will always be some level of uncertainty, because science is not like a yes or no thing. There's always a gray area. Data are not always completely conclusive. Even though there's always some level of uncertainty, you need to figure out what the best evidence is and what to do with that evidence. But at the same time, remain humble, because there are people who come from different backgrounds than you and may know more about how that actually translates into policymaking. Next slide, please. So, oh, I think there was a question on the chat. Sure. So somebody said, can you elaborate on what political knowledge is in this context? So that goes back to sort of like the humility thing. When I'm talking about political knowledge, I'm sort of talking about how the government works, how you take scientific data and turn it into a bill or a law, what the process of a bill becoming a law is. Like scientists like vaguely understand that, and you can understand those things by educating yourself while you're like starting to get involved with science policy. However, people whose careers are in the political realm will know more on this than you. So you sort of act as a messenger, sort of conveying, this is what the data are, this is what the data mean. And you can help advise what you think the best policies are, but you need to just remain humble in that the people actually involved in the politics and strictly involved in the politics will be more knowledgeable in some cases than you. This is not to say if you think somebody's making a wrong policy decision, don't speak up, because you probably are right in that scenario, but just be humble and careful in the way you address certain topics. I hope that clears that up. Are there any other questions before we go into breakout rooms? Okay, if not, then basically, you're welcome. If not, then I would definitely take a screenshot of this slide so that you can see it in your breakout room. But what this is we want you to discuss ways you think science could relate to the following case study. I think someone asked another question. Does political knowledge also include knowing who other stakeholders are and what their needs are? Yes, exactly. So, but when I'm talking about political knowledge, I'm sorry, maybe I should have made it clearer, but it's just what politics are, who's involved, all of the nuances of it, because we all understand the nuances of our specific areas of science and how the scientific process works. And that's the stuff that you're sort of contributing in science policy to the policymakers. But ultimately in science policy, scientists are not the ones who make the final decision. So we are more sort of informing the policymakers so that they can do what they believe is the correct transfer of this information. So exactly, like we don't know exactly who the other stakeholders are, what the complex interactions are between the environment and society and business, et cetera. So although we sort of have scientific knowledge and we know the basis of this, we might not know enough to make decisions ourselves because we don't understand the interactions between sort of business, science, environment, society, et cetera. And so, yeah, exactly as Kultum is saying, it's a very complicated and dynamic area because it's policy for science and science for policy. You sort of, everything's intertwined, and at the same time, you can't know everything about policy, you can't know everything about science, but we're ultimately, scientists are there to play our role in giving the understanding of the scientific knowledge so that the most informed decisions can be made. And so I hope that clears some of that up. And then in breakout rooms, we wanted you to discuss ways you think science could be related to the following case study, because in science policy, it's sort of important to see all the different complexities and nuances in every different case study and what relates. So this says, failing infrastructure is a problem across the country, but in Mississippi, it's a full-blown crisis. Nearly 500 bridges are in such disrepair that the State Department of Transportation had to close them, in some cases isolating rural residents. Communities and local businesses are pressing Magnolia state lawmakers to fix the deteriorating thoroughfares, but measures to deal with the problem have yet to gain traction. So just discuss a little how you think science could relate to this. Be creative, because I'm sure there are an infinite number of answers. As we've already discussed, science is involved with everything, and you guys probably already knew that as scientists. And then Ashraf said, how much time for the breakout room? We're planning on 5 minutes. Do you guys feel like 5 minutes was too short the first time? Maybe we could increase it a little. I'm not sure. If nobody has any like ideas, I guess we'll just keep it at 5 minutes. And when you come back, we can sort of debrief on it. So with that, I think we'll open the breakout rooms. So in your breakout rooms, was there anything interesting that anyone wants to share? Because sort of, I guess you probably saw in your breakout rooms, and we'll see when people discuss, but the point of this was to show, even in things that don't seem super related to science, that are just sort of like mainly governmental stuff, there's always some aspect of science that can impact it. And that's why science policy is so important, because scientists need to be there to play the role of informant and helping ensure that the correct decisions are made, and like the most correct, because there's not always right and wrong, but there's most correct and some that are okay but not as correct. And so I guess, did anyone in the breakout rooms Did anyone in the breakout rooms have any sort of ideas that they want to share that they thought were really interesting, that maybe, oh, somebody in my group said this and I didn't even really think that that could be related to this issue?
I can talk about what we talked about in our room a little bit. So I come from sort of a computer science robotics background, and the first thing that we would think to approach this with is like operations research, modeling the roads as like a network flow problem, and sort of measuring, you know, which bridges, if we only have some certain amount of money, which bridges are the most effective for us to repair. You know, how can we connect the most people back to highways or grocery stores or whatever most essential services they need. And you can use that to prioritize your money really well. And maybe you only repair 200 bridges, but it helps a lot more people.
Yeah, that's an awesome point. Like Shannon said in the chat, I definitely never would have thought of that. And that again shows, goes back to that point where when I first was like looking at getting involved in science policy, it was like, I know about biology, I know about like the silo or whatever, but I don't know about a lot of different areas of science. But honestly, the silo sometimes helps. For example, like you come from a robotics computer science background, and I never would have thought of anything like that, but you could help make the answer to this issue sort of that much more beneficial and helpful. Did anyone else have any sort of points they wanted to make before we move on?
So our group actually had a similar idea to what Walker's group did, where we essentially wanted to like look at the network and see, you know, how everything's interconnected and what the effects of taking away those connections are. And sorry, this is the joke I wanted to tell. This is the abridged version of our recommendations. But we also wanted to ask, why are these the bridges that are failing in the first place? Is there something due to their construction, where they're constructed, how they're constructed, that led to certain ones breaking? And as we move forward, will that be able to inform how or where we construct new bridges? So that's kind of where we were. Sorry for the bad joke.
No, we love a good bad joke here. The poll questions didn't work, but we wanted to know everyone's opinion on pineapple on pizza. So we're definitely one for bad jokes and cliche here. So much appreciated. But yeah, back to that, like you can just see from those two comments. I don't want to spend too much time just because Divya and Maeve have a lot of great stuff to tell too. But like those two comments were so different, but both so helpful to sort of analyzing the problem from a variety of different perspectives. And I'm sure we could talk about this issue, which is not even one of the most complex ones, for a very long time. And so obviously, like engineers and inspectors deem the aging crossings unsafe for vehicles. That's sort of an obvious way that science was related. And also after the tax, what ultimately ended up happening was after the tax-averse legislature failed to pass a repair plan this past March, the governor announced that the Department of Transportation would immediately close another 83 bridges. And so just sort of like thinking about that, 83 bridges being closed, you can only imagine how much science policy and the role of scientists, how important it was in that decision. So I just thought this was a pretty cool example that Divya found to sort of show science is crucial in policymaking, even in areas that you wouldn't think it's so complex, and so many different kinds of science could be applied. Like all different kinds of science can almost always be applied. And it's sort of cool to think that there are a variety of different areas you can be in except the lab, which is what most of us are used to. And then Aaron said they also discussed using drones to evaluate the bridges and determine which were most in need to repair to avoid a total loss of the structure. So yeah, everyone had a variety of completely different ideas, which sort of makes sense because we come from a variety of different science backgrounds. And then, yeah, what Shannon said, if anyone else has something really creative, then definitely put it in the chat and we could come back to it at the end if there's time, because this definitely was like a thought-provoking case study. But yeah, so now I guess we'll move on to Divya's portion. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so now that you've heard from Claire and Hayden about, science policy and some of the things that you maybe need to engage with science policy. We'll talk a little bit about, once you're there, what do you actually do in terms of science policy, and what are some roles that you can take on? So, next slide, please. So there's really two ways to come at this. And one of them is, if science policy is really your bread and butter, and that's what you're pursuing a career in, then there's some options there. I know many of us are, research scientists, and we're pursuing that path. And, there's many, many different options. And these are just a few of them, very specific ones, that you can kind of have science as your bread and butter, and pursue science policy kind of on the side. So really starting with, if you are pursuing a career in science policy, one of the big things is working directly for legislators in Congress. And, really here you're serving as like a conduit between the legislators and the policy that they're enacting and kind of the science, and any like scientifically focused constituents. You also have the opportunity to work for societies like the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. And many societies like these have their kind of own agendas and what sort of, research funding that they want to promote. And this is more of an example of policy for science, and kind of trying to influence that in government. Now, kind of coming to the biggest point, I think, for all of us that we're going to take away the most here is, as a scientist first, how do we engage in policy? And I think one of the big ways to do that and kind of get our voice out is, by writing op-eds in journals and magazines about, issues that maybe our research affects, or just even issues that we can speak on because of our expertise in science overall. Right? I think we all bring a lot to the table just in terms of our analytical skills and the way that we think about the world. And I think that's something that needs to be shared on whatever issues you guys see fit. Another really big thing in terms of getting involved with the policy process itself is, when bills are passed, there's often a, rules changes or like a public comment period. And with a lot of bills and laws, there, has been this period where, they're seeking feedback on how well this policy, may do, or what areas it may affect. And I think as scientists, we can have a really great understanding on what are the potential impacts in certain areas, and we have the opportunity to give our input and be directly involved in the process there. I think also as individuals, we have a lot of power to reach directly out, to our legislators on issues that matter to us. If there's a policy issue that you think, maybe what if we thought about it this way, or, here's an area that you can advocate on. We can reach out directly. And we also have the power to provide information to, regulatory agencies such as, the EPA and others, that are maybe seeking feedback or, seeking, ways of implementing climate change policy that, are going to make, implement green energy and things like that. So those are all ways that we can get involved. So next slide, please. Yeah. And I kind of want to make a note on science policy here, in recognizing that, science is only part of the policymaking process. Science is what we can, it puts what we know on the table and acknowledge that it leads to a variety of options. And really the government will then consider, public opinion, what the public thinks, and elections and electoral contests, fiscal priorities and so forth. And I think it's important to understand that, sometimes there are a lot of other forces at play within the policy process, aside from the evidence and the science that we bring to the table. I think kind of in relation to the bridge problem, I think, we all came up with so many great solutions to really look at, how can we solve this problem from a scientific perspective to really make the best policy agenda. But sometimes, there's other forces like, is there funding, or do we want to employ certain contractors? Kind of what is the legislature saying, and what is, the balance there, and how many legislators are for or against this bill. And sometimes those are other forces that may get in the way of certain policy being implemented, and something that we should keep in mind as we're being involved in this process. Okay, so I think this is a really great example that kind of shows, where the science is really involved and sometimes how long it can take, for action to happen. So I think we all really know about this example, of the smoking, research on smoking and its connection to lung cancer. I think the first studies were really done back in the 1950s, showing that smoking causes cancer, that it's a causal relationship, right? But it took a decade to be really accepted in the medical community, and then even longer for politicians to, implement policies that are going to have a direct impact on, smoking rates, lung cancer rates. As you can see in this graphic here, the smoking rates really declined with the actions that we take. And it took a little bit of time for that to happen. And, the delay that you can see wasn't just due to the lack of evidence. I would say the evidence and the research was there, from the very beginning, showing this relationship. But sometimes we really have to look at the other pieces of the puzzle, right? Whether that's building alliances with different stakeholders who are involved. I think a large part of that was, dealing with tobacco companies, right? And, challenging those vested interests and, changing televised ads and warnings on packages, right? So those are all different elements that, had to happen as part of the policy process, even after we had that initial evidence to show that smoking is bad, tobacco is bad for our lungs. So yeah, that's really a key part, and really shows the example of, sometimes there are other forces at play that are going to impact how policy is created, coming in as a scientist. So, next slide, please. Okay. So as we get involved in the process, I think Hayden kind of touched on this a bit. We can really come in two ways, right? There's a perspective where we can come in as a person who's going to advocate, use this evidence and then, give advice to recommend a particular course of action over another. And that's certainly something that we can do. Another way to come at it is really just to inform and just lay out the facts and say, this is the research that's been done. This is kind of their conclusions, but not really advocate or say that one option is better than another. And I think both are totally valid. Both are totally things that we as scientists can do. And it really just depends on the context and what your goals are as a scientist being involved in policy. Do you want to advocate, or do you just want to inform and ensure that, legislators and politicians have the facts on hand to make whatever decisions they feel are best for their communities? So I think another thing to address that was brought up earlier in terms of concerns was really, potential partisanship and maybe a scientist wanting to stay neutral. And I guess that really comes in, and who are you advising? How are you advising them? I think, if you were to be partisan, you could be working on someone's campaign and, really talking about a certain issue in a certain way that that politician would support. It's also very possible to not be partisan and really just advocate, for a certain policy or inform on a certain policy issue. It just really depends on how you want to go about it and what your goals are. Okay. So this is a little bit of a kind of a case study that we're going back to, where science is really useful in the policy process, even if it doesn't seem immediately so. So, I think we all heard about, back in Puerto Rico in 2017, they had a terrible hurricane season, and, there was not a lot of attention given to what was going on and some of the issues that were there. And I think a big question to consider is, is the island going to be prepared for the next storm? And what are some of the variables that we have to take into account? I think, when we think about storm patterns and climate change, is there going to be a level of resilience in whatever structural engineering problems that there are? Are we going to be able to supply food and water, and kind of what are the systems to do so? So those are all like places where science can definitely be involved, and a big part of how we implement certain legislation. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on how, or what science considerations we can really take into account for this issue.
Well, I know that one of the issues that's been very tricky in Puerto Rico, given all the hurricanes, is the lack of their energy grid resiliency. So when the storms come through, they knock out electricity to significant portions of the island for extended periods of time. I believe in 2017, there were many people without power for months and months. And so one way that that can be avoided is to look at the science and the data for what options we have to make a more resilient energy system on the island. One thing that potentially would work is solar panels or windmills that can be deployed to like local towns or something, so that when a storm comes, because it's not like they're not expecting one, with climate change, we know that we're going to see more and more storms that are more and more powerful. This could be something that people are encouraged to put money into building these systems instead of rebuilding the old systems, which are going to fail at the same points as they have in the past.
Yeah, that is a really great example. Really going to maybe the heart and looking at this from, a scientific perspective, and ensuring that we're not doing things the same way that we've been doing them in the past, to really ensure that, whatever we do from a policy perspective actually has an impact, on the situation there. I think another point is that, considering climate change patterns and some of the uncertainty, what if we look at the weather systems and climate change and try to understand, what systems and, roads or bridges are going to be most impacted, and how are they impacted, and kind of, how can we make them more resilient, essentially. So I think that was a really great example with, the energy systems in place there. Any other thoughts? If not, we can move on.
Some kind of like earth science in terms, or like, I guess, oceanographic science, or in terms of like what parts of the island are, or just like looking historically, what parts have been, the hardest hit, and like trying to relocate key infrastructure. It's kind of similar to Aaron saying, but like not just the electricity grid, but just key infrastructure to the safest parts of the island could be helpful.
So there's another island in the Caribbean that I want to say is Martinique, but I don't actually remember. That's been they were almost completely leveled at one point, and they've been redoing their infrastructure to address not just energy, like the energy grid, but also architecture that's more resilient to hurricanes, that's elevated off the ground. And I think for this issue, there's no shortage of ideas, but I think when mentioning Puerto Rico, it'd be remiss in not bringing up that there's a lot of political challenges that I don't think that there are many people have already come up with these ideas. I think at some point, I forget if it was Mark Zuckerberg or another big tech giant wanted to like literally build the energy grid themselves for Puerto Rico. So, but I think the main obstacle in helping Puerto Rico prepare for the next hurricane is a purely political one, which I find to be frustrating. And I don't know if you want to address that at all or anything.
Yeah, no, I think that is such a great point, and really goes back to the part where, we have so much research, we have so much evidence to, to be able to solve these problems and, be better prepared. And there is 110% a kind of a political force that is sometimes preventing these solutions from being enacted. Sometimes that's something we don't have control over, or maybe we do, depending on how you want to approach science policy. If you're, being an advocate and going and telling, or politicians, hey, this is how we need to get it done. And sometimes the lack of, political willpower is an obstacle to, to do what we need to do in terms of, sustainability and resilience in this example. So definitely agree. Thank you.
Thanks.
I think we're ready to move on. So yeah, I think we've seen two really great examples of, situations where science is innately useful to how we're going to come out and how we're going to approach these policies. So I have a little bit of a challenge for you guys in your next breakout room, and that's kind of to think of a policy solution that doesn't have a scientific component. Or doesn't have a situation in which we can look at science to improve that policy. So I'd love to hear what you guys think, because I was unable to find one, but maybe you guys will be able to. So I guess there's a few things in the chat I'd love to highlight. I think Erin said, in speaking to the to the political problems sometimes that arise in the policymaking process. She says that it's really important for us as scientists to help bridge those partisan gaps. Talking to people on both sides of the aisle and helping them understand the facts. And you might be surprised about how much headway you can make with politicians who disagree with you. And I think that's so true. I think having face-to-face conversations and really talking about the facts and the way that our science and evidence works in supporting certain policies. I think that's definitely a big thing that we as scientists can do to help bridge that partisan gap where politics does become really a blockade in getting certain policy enacted. So I think that's really, really important to bring to everyone's attention. So thank you so much for that, Erin. Okay, so now I kind of want to open it up to you guys and ask, were you guys able to think of any policies that don't have a scientific component?
The trick question.
Yeah. Or any thoughts about your discussion in general?
We sort of ran into the problem that, like, if you consider data analysis science, then the answer is no, right? Because any policy, at least on the level of should be data driven, and if we make the policy, we should then collect data and evaluate if it works. So at least on that level, right, there is no policy where science has no role to play.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it definitely depends on our definition of science, like Erin mentioned in the chat. I think that's really remarkable because I think it shows us that as scientists, as people who work with evidence and data and follow a scientific process, we really have the ability to speak on a lot of policy issues and really look at that evidence and inform or advocate depending on what we're doing for certain solutions. So I think we as scientists have a role to play, and we belong in these spaces. So I hope we've all taken away that really important point. So yeah, we could not do it. So I think we know science is pretty.
So I made an argument. The first thing that came to mind for me was court packing, or the issue of court packing, because really that's like purely politically driven in terms of, so like the outcome is purely based on what political desires or partisan desires are. And I don't really know that there's directly a scientific component there that can be applied.
Yeah. I think I definitely agree with that. I think within the political realm itself and the way that politics and our branches of government work, and maybe making that more efficient or, quote unquote, better in a certain way, I think that it maybe is one area where we can't look to science to help us.
I disagree.
Yeah, I also disagree.
It's
What about
game
political
theory.
science?
Here are those opinions. So
I mean, game theory is all about how something like court packing would impact future decisions. So.
Right, but those decisions are in and of themselves politically motivated. So you can have some idea about how the decisions will pan out, but if they're, there's, I would say, better or worse is in a lot of ways subjective, in that you have people who will agree with them and people who won't. I mean, one of the things that we discussed in my room is that like, well, you could compare that against public opinion or against how policies or how those rulings align with other scientific data. But I think in and of itself, it's kind of it might be a bit of a stretch.
Well, you can also pick, you can pick like an optimal solution, and you can make that decision from the get-go, and you can put different types of solutions and see how something could converge onto that solution and across. And then as a field, economics doesn't focus on like one person's individual decision, it focuses on the whole group, right? And I'm less familiar with political science, but I'm fairly certain that's the whole field called science, like focuses on improving politics, right? So I don't know, I guess, is your thing more of a like philosophical level or of a strategic thing? Because I think when you talk strategic, then there's a lot of people studying that here at Penn. Yeah.
Right, but I think the strategy depends on what your desired outcome is. So I don't know that. Yeah, and that's the issue is, right. So like different people have different desires.
But there's a scientific component to guaranteeing your desires in the presence of noise, right? So if I belong to one party and I want to guarantee that the court provides the most favorable decisions to my party, right? I need to make a data-driven. I can try to make a data-driven decision about whether having more justices or fewer justices in the long run is better for me.
Absolutely. But that all assumes that your party or your desires are the right ones.
It doesn't really matter. I mean, like I can make a scientific judgment on whether how best to get my policies enacted.
Sure, but my argument is that maybe that isn't the best for the country, just the best for what you want, and that's why I'm saying I don't know that it is philosophical. Is what I'm saying.
So, Stephen, I think you're bringing up I think what we're getting hung up on here is there. At some level, for every policy question, there's whatever science can tell us about what the world is, but then there's the question of what to do with that information. And that is a values judgment. And a value judgment cannot be made by scientific inquiry. That has to do with a bunch of different things that each person values. And so you cannot, so in all cases of a scientific policy, when you're advising for policy, you're basing your advice on the evidence, but also on what you value. So if you say the climate is changing and therefore we should do X, you're trying to avoid certain outcomes or make certain outcomes come about. But there's no objective scientific way to say that that is the correct outcome to want. You're just saying this is what the science says, and based on my values, this is what we should do. And so I think that applies for court packing as well as things that are more overtly scientific.
Well, I would just like to it off by saying that was a good discussion, I think, with a lot of different views. But I think in the end, there really is the scientific evidence, and what we do with it, like the value judgment that Shannon mentioned. I think that really is another key point to consider. After collecting our evidence and our data, what do we do with it? What does it mean? And I think it's a little different, or another part of this whole complex puzzle, I think we can say. So yeah, thank you all for having that discussion. I think we can move on to Maeve's section.
Thank you, Divya. So yeah, we've heard from Hayden what are the skills that scientists have that are valuable in informing policy. And as Divya mentioned, the roles that scientists are involved in policy making. And so what I wanted to touch on is what are some of the steps that we as early career scientists can be taking now to get involved in policy or prepare for careers that would involve being involved in science policy. Next slide, please. And so, like Divya had mentioned, there are different roles that scientists fulfill in policymaking, right? And we can think that there are many different scientific career trajectories that can fulfill these different roles. We can think of scientists being advisors in policies, and that could be a low commitment of an academic scientist that occasionally provides data interpretation for policymakers to inform a policy. We can also think of this as a full-time career or contracted work where the scientist analyzes policy. But we can also think of scientists as being advocates for policies where they're not neutral, but using data evidence to suggest a policy to be made, changed, or redacted. But we can also think of scientists being actuators of policy by running for office or being appointed. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to emphasize, right, that careers outside of directly working in government can fulfill all of those different roles. So careers in academia, industry, different research institutions, nonprofits, they all have opportunities and roles for scientists to engage in policy space. Next slide, please. And so Hayden had mentioned the Harvard Science Policy Career Study, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about it. So in those interviews they had with PhD trained scientists that later had careers in policy and governance, they found that virtually all of these scientists had cited that being heavily involved in extracurricular activities during graduate school was crucial for a successful transition into getting involved in science policy later in their career. And many had cited that participating in internships and fellowships outside of academia and getting immersed in policy as important elements of that transition as well. And of course, there are other valuable career development activities to be getting involved in as an early career scientist, like teaching and mentoring and founding extracurricular organizations that are not directly involved in policy, but build on some of those critical skills in communication. Next slide, please. And of course, I just want to highlight that, right, PSPDG has opportunities for getting involved if most, if not all of these different extracurricular experiences that are so crucial for getting involved in policy and building on these communication skills. And so to keep an eye out for workshops that we'll have on fellowships and opportunities to lobby and workshops on writing policy memos and just more opportunities to learn about science policy. Next slide, please. And so what are some concrete steps outside of general career trajectories? What are steps right now that I can take to learn more about science policy? Next slide, please. So luckily, there are some really great educational resources to learn more about science policy. So I wanted to highlight that the National Science Policy Network has a series of educational modules on different science policy topics. So right, anything from what is science policy to tips for scientists to work on their communication skills to communicate scientific information to policy makers and other non-scientific audiences. There's also modules that's going to talk about different scientific institutions, academia, industry, professional societies, and specifically what are their motivations for investing in science policy and how exactly they interface with the policy space. And so this is also a great way to see how different scientific institutions outside of government are interacting with policy spaces. Next slide, please. And so another great resource on learning more about science policy would be the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And this is a newer journal that is written and directed towards early career scientists. And their articles cover really a broad range of anything at the intersection of science, policy, and governance. And this is also a really great resource for getting familiar with policy memos, which memo policies are really the currency of policy and a crucial way that policymakers communicate. And so learning and reading science policy is a great way to start getting involved in this and policy analysis. And next slide, please. Just wanted to emphasize that at PSPDG, we do have workshops on writing policy memos, and that the Journal of Science Policy and Governance has had now 2 years of international competitions on policy memo writing, and that for the past 2 years, PSPDG has done very well in this, coming first place the first year they did it and second place this year. So we have a lot of great resources right here at PSPDG to learn about policy memo and get involved in that. And then next slide. Thank you. Another event that I wanted to highlight is the National Science Policy Symposium is coming up in less than a month on November 13th and 14th. And the theme for this year's symposium is going to be on racial justice. So specifically, what are the ways that science and policy historically have failed to include minority voices, and the ways that science policy needs to be leveraged to strategically leveraged to be more inclusive and equitable. And so there's going to be a lot of opportunities to network with people involved in science policy, lots of speakers and discussion panels and workshops, and there will be some flash talks by PSPDG. And oh, I think I just saw that there's a comment. Okay, it's free for NSPN members. Okay, yes. There's a fee for becoming a member, but then the symposium is free. Thank you, Erin. And yes, and that this is really a great opportunity for any level of experience for science policy to network and learn more about current issues in science policy. And next slide. And then finally, I wanted to touch a little bit on fellowships. So fellowships are a really great opportunity to build networks and practice using your scientific expertise to inform policy. They typically tend to be a year long, and many of them are directed towards PhD trained scientists, but there are some opportunities for undergraduates and graduate students, and I've included a link that provides a list of different science policy fellowships, but we will be having an upcoming panel through PSPDG with people who have gone through the science policy fellowship process to learn more about that. And next slide, please. And yeah, so if you have any questions for me or any of the other members of this group, that would be great. Thank you.
So thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm sorry that we went a little bit over, but we wanted to make sure that you guys got all the information that we wanted to give you and had time in the breakout rooms. So thank you so much.